reactions from across the countries continue to pour in for Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated in the US. He was known as an American right-wing activist and close ally of former US President Donald Trump, who was shot dead during an event in Utah in the US. Though an American figure, Kirk's influence in South Africa reflects the globalization of conservatism, Christian conservatism in particular, and far-right narratives. His death raises questions about whether it will galvanize or fragment these networks locally. A Pretoria-based religious organization, South African Community of Faith-Based Fraternals and Federations, has called on all people of goodwill across political and religious divides to defend free speech, stand for non-violence, and let faith inform action, offering compassion, integrity, and truth, not coercion or extremism. However, SECOF's president, Pastor Bert Pretorius, clarified that his organization did not share or endorse Kirk's views regarding South Africa and its social justice policies. He attributed Kirk's mistaken views to ignorance and blamed lobby groups and commentators with ulterior motives for the distorted lens through which many people in the West saw South Africa. Author and feminist scholar Lihle Ngcobozi, as well as Pontsho Pilane, the author of Power and Faith, joins me now. Lihle, good evening. Pontsho, thank you so much for joining me. Lihle, I want to start the conversation with you. When we talk about the right wing, do we talk exclusively about conservative people, or are we incorrectly using those words interchangeably? What are we talking about when we talk about the right wing?
I mean, I think more globally, if we think about it, the right wing, if we're looking more specifically about the hegemony of US politics, when we talk about right wingers, we are talking about those who would classically fall within the Republican sort of sect of politics, of organizing in the US. But I think it plays out quite differently when we think about post-colonial territories, or even when we think about post-democratic countries similar to South Africa, right, where the organizing of sort of the post-colonial is not as cleanly defined as the liberal or the independents or the Democrats versus sort of the Republicans per se. So I think when it comes to Africa or African countries, and if we look at South Africa specifically, I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, because we do have elements related to what we would call tradition, culture, Christianity, and also the likes of racism, sexism, homophobia, and all the other isms that informs some of the political identities and shaping of political parties as well. So I think it's a bit more nuanced to say that we have the similar arrangements politically, but I think the similar ideologies do play out in South Africa across the different stratas of society, the different ways in which people organize politically and otherwise.
Yeah. Pontsho, the liberal and the left view almost everything that the right and the conservatives stand for as being backward, immoral, and perhaps repressive, right? And more sensible assessment of what the conservative and the right are is that sometimes they have reasonable debates about reasonable things, right? Or albeit that those debates don't often manifest as a reasonable debate about reasonable things. But where do we draw the line between what should be a debate that can be had versus a debate that should never be a debate?
I think, Oliver, the first place where we should draw the line is around whose rights or which marginalized groups are oppressed by that conversation, right? If we look back, particularly historically, on even where the religious right, or what the US calls the moral majority, started, it was politically motivated, that, and it hid behind religion, particularly evangelical right-wing ideologies, to push an ideological agenda for the Republican Party. So we really need to locate what the arguments that these people particularly make, such as Charlie Kirk, and what they're rooted in. They're often rooted in expecting marginalized, or people who are already living in the margins of society, to remain marginalized. They're often dependent on their own privilege being amplified and them being able to get away with not getting equality or equity in society. And this, again, as Lihle was talking about, that we have to locate this also in a post-colonial understanding. And I think even an understanding American and Western imperialism as a whole on how these things then manifest globally, but also locally.
Why, Pontsho, does the conservative right love to appeal to scripture and the Bible as a source for their politics?
I mean, first is because Christianity is one of the most majority religions in the world, right? Or even we can sum it up to Abrahamic faiths in general. And so they are able to do this because of the distortion of religious texts that has been happening, that justified colonialism, that justified the enslavement of African people and the Atlantic trade, that even justified apartheid. So it is a historical, tactic that has worked over the years, and we see its replication. And I think now, because we are in a haze of living in a democratic, a global world, that we forget that these things can manifest in different ways. But ultimately, it is also about a reaction to a move to more progressive ways of living in society, whether it's through policy, whether it's through respecting women more, whether it's through ensuring sexual reproductive health is something that is more accessible to people. We see this pushback, and we can historically trace it to see that particularly when certain political movements happened, there was a backlash, and that backlash was right-leaning in many ways.
Lihle, why is Charlie's assassination so resonant with so many South Africans who, I would go through my Facebook and I was like, I thought this would have been a person of sensible politics, and they're pouring out their heart to this moment in a way that seems very sincere. And that took me by surprise, that there's so many sensible, good faith politics people or have good faith political positions who seem to be drawn in by what is very clearly a distorted politics that Charlie Kirk stood for on the right. Why is it so resonant with so many South Africans?
I mean, I think also mirroring the shift that is happening globally, and I hate to sort of use the US as sort of the proxy for when I say global. However, I'll do that in this instance. But I think the shift in American politics over the last 4 or 5 years, increasingly now with the re-election of the current president that is holding that seat of power in the White House, you are seeing the emboldenedness of people to be able to publicly and visibly express what they wouldn't necessarily have expressed 10 years ago, right? And so we're seeing the validation that is coming out of a global superpower such as the United States of America, emboldening people to be able to express these ideas that are deeply anti-democratic, deeply racist, in my opinion, and also deeply sexist and homophobic, and all the other isms, as Pontsho mentioned, that are significantly targeted at those that are marginalized or sort of structurally dispossessed in one way or the other. But what's unique about South Africa, I think, is that we're at the time where we are also seeing increasingly the rise of cultural chauvinism or traditional chauvinism, where we are seeing this brassness of traditional masculinity sort of playing out in society in a way that is emboldening men to publicly display a brassness of masculinity that I think we were able as feminist scholars to really interrogate and think through, but with not just only the increase of United States politics, but I also think pop culture as well in South Africa through the podcasts that we've seen, things that we're seeing in terms of what we call the manosphere, right? All these spaces where men are emboldened to speak about women, women, homosexual people, transgender people or folk in a way that is deeply dehumanizing. We're seeing that validation take place in pop culture, which is also finding expression in politics, and it's also finding expression in political parties as well in South Africa. And I'm not going to mention names, but I think we've seen that increasingly with our previous general elections. And so it shouldn't really surprise us, but what should be surprising is that the shift in South African cultural and political what we call discussion, debates, they are shifting in a way that is deeply, deeply conservative and deeply warrants. And so I'm not really surprised that this is playing out, but I do think that the influence of global superpowers and the shift within global superpower politics, specifically in the United States, emboldens sort of what we would call, not third world, but sort of emerging economies per se, to be able to resonance in some of these utterances.
Yeah. Pontsho, does this have the potential, the holding on to these politics have the potential to seep into and contaminate what ultimately becomes the political life of South Africans? And I ask this because it seems like we're really good in South Africa at drawing a line between where our religious convictions end, where our political aspirations begin, right? Otherwise, the ACDP would have done tremendously well in South Africa if that weren't the case. I'm speculating here. But is there the potential for that to spill on over?
I think it has already spilled over, and this is something that I've dedicated the past about 5 years in investigating. For instance, there are organizations masquerading as NGOs that are operating in South Africa, getting funded by Western right-wing organizations, mostly based in the US, to do anti-rights work. Right now, we have a big organization that has started anti-trans ideology conversations in schools, where petitions have started to stop trans kids from going to schools, where petitions have started to prevent the gender markings of trans people of being changed. We have NGOs that masquerade as abortion centers, whereas they actually manipulate young women or pregnant people into keeping their pregnancies. And that model has historically and scientifically been proven to come from the US. Right now, in 2027, the biggest anti-rights African values conference will be happening in South Africa. This is a conference that happens every 2 years, where people from across, like a lot of faith, like people who declare that they're faith leaders in their communities and in their countries, gather together to learn from Western countries on how to prevent comprehensive sexuality education, the liberalization of abortion laws. Some of these people, one of the speakers at the conference that happened in Kenya just a few months ago is the person who advised the Nigerian, the Ghanaian, and the Ugandan government on their anti-homophobia acts and bills. So we're already seeing this, and this conference is coming to South Africa in 2027. They're that emboldened. You understand?
My goodness.
Every few years, there's a petition with 1,000 and sometimes millions of signatures to the Department of Basic Education, where not just parents and these groups are signing, saying that they don't want comprehensive sexuality education, even though it has been proven to help decrease teenage pregnancy, HIV infection, and all the other things that we call social ills in society. So, and I speak passionately about this because I think there is this confidence that this is not happening in South Africa. But I think our Facebook friends or our social media friends who have come out, who say they are religious in one way or the other, to support the likes of Charlie Kirk, are exhibiting those. It's parents joining SGBs and fighting for these things to be removed from schools. And socially, I think constitutionally and legally we are protected, but I think on a social level we are not protected from our progressive policies being in place. And we're going to start seeing that seep into politics, as Lihle said earlier on.
My goodness. Wow. So much more to unpack there, but unfortunately that's all the time we have. Pontsho, thank you so much for your time. Lihle, thank you so much for your time. Both your insights were incredibly valuable here. Pontsho's book, Power and Faith, is still in bookstores nationwide. You can get it. Lihle's book, Manyano, still in bookstores nationwide, at least I hope so, Lihle. Your book was published several years ago, but pretty sure you can still find it. Do go out and get those books that expand to a great deal and great detail into the political life that we live as South Africans.